Stote.
My lady, good morning. Before we start the evidence today, there are a number of witness statements relating to week one evidence that we ask your permission to adduce into evidence and for publication on the inquiry's website.
Certainly.
If I could ask that the list of documents be brought up, please. There they are, my lady. There's a second page. Yes. Thank you very much. They provide important additional contextual information and background which will assist you, my lady, when considering the evidence that you've heard in this investigation and in your report. Thank you. My lady, the first witness today is Helen Waitley. May the witness please be sworn.
Stand, please. Take the Bible in your right hand. Repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing
but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Could you please give the court your full name?
Helen Waitley.
You very helpfully provided the inquiry with a witness statement, the inquiry reference for which is INQ 000535015, dated the 23rd of January 2025. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Waitley, you are and have been the Member of Parliament for Faversham and Mid Kent since 2015.
Yes.
And you are, I think, currently the Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions.
Yes.
You have, in the past, held various positions within the Conservative Party and ministerial roles, but in terms of the relevant position you held in relation to the scope of the procurement module of this inquiry, you served as Minister of State for Care from the 13th of February 2020 to the 16th of September of 2021. Is that correct?
Yes.
You are, of course, aware that Module 6 of this inquiry is investigating the impact of the pandemic on the public and privately funded adult social care sector. So the focus of my questions this morning is about the procurement of key medical equipment, procurement and distribution of key medical equipment and supplies during the pandemic for the care sector.
Yes.
In terms of the scope of your ministerial brief, that's as Minister of Care, you say that when you were first appointed in that role, your portfolio, as agreed by the Secretary of State, Mr. Hancock, consisted of, amongst a number of other things, adult social care. Is that right?
Yes.
You say that from early March of 2020, your ministerial role was focused predominantly on the COVID-19 response. Is that right?
Yes.
Perhaps understandably so.
Mm-hmm.
You say, as your portfolio included adult social care, during the pandemic, you were involved in decisions to ensure that systems and processes were in place so that key healthcare equipment and supplies were distributed and available to the social care sector. Is that right?
Sorry, could you just repeat that?
Yes, of course. You say in your statement that you were not involved in direct operational decisions about procurement.
Yes.
That's, I think, the distinction that you draw. Is that right?
Correct, yeah.
But that you were involved in decisions to ensure that the systems and processes enabled the distribution of the key healthcare equipment supplies into the social care sector. Is that correct? You say that you provided strategic direction on policy, which included liaising with various individuals and bodies. That's within the care sector, is it?
Mm-hmm.
On issues such as the prioritisation of the social care sector when decisions were made in respect of those medical equipment supplies. Yeah. Just for completeness, you do tell us that from September of 2021 to July of 2022, you were Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury. Is that right?
Yes.
But during that time and in that role, you were not involved in any decisions concerning PPE, healthcare equipment or supplies.
That is correct.
Thank you. I want to turn first, please, to the issue of pandemic preparedness. In your witness statement, you say that in common with many other countries, adult social care is a devolved and diverse sector, which you say provided a difficult starting point for a pandemic that needed a rapid and coordinated response to make the most of limited resources like COVID-19 tests and PPE. Is that right?
Yes.
You say in your statement that while in England the NHS has NHS England and a substantial team at the Department for Health and Social Care to develop, implement and monitor policy and activity, at the start of the pandemic, the adult social care team was rather different to that. Is that right?
Yes, and I can give a little more
Yes,
insight
please.
into that. Although, could I just take a moment, as
Of course.
this is my first appearance at this inquiry following the pandemic, to say that I know that many thousands of people lost their lives during the pandemic, including many thousands who received social care. And for me as Care Minister, that's something I spend much time thinking about. And I would like to say to the loved ones of those people who died, how sorry I am for their loss, and how particularly sorry I am that I know how hard it was that many people didn't get to spend time with their loved ones during the pandemic and never got to say goodbye. And I would also like to say a thank you to the many healthcare and social care workers who were at the front line, some of whom indeed also lost their lives, but who I know went above and beyond, and also to many colleagues in the civil service who I know worked incredibly hard during that time.
Thank you very much.
Shall I give a little more on the point that you were just making about the
Yes.
difference between something I was very conscious of, because my brief was across health and social care, so I was social care was in my portfolio, but also the NHS workforce, and that was clearly a substantial responsibility and something I was spending in the early time, particularly actually throughout my time as a minister, a significant amount of time on the NHS workforce side. But there's a significant difference between the infrastructure and capacity at the centre to support the NHS relative to social care, where you had a very significant number of civil servants in the Department of Health and Social Care on the NHS side, but also the organisation of NHS England with its operational capabilities and oversight capabilities, while social care, the Department of Health, was a relatively small team, very focused on policy, and particularly at that time on the charging reform policy, and just was not set up, nor was it intended to have that kind of operational reach out into the social care sector. So that was a very different starting point for social care compared to the NHS.
Yes. You say in your statement that, I think as a consequence of that, DHSC had to devote significant resources and time into creating what you describe as communication channels at scale and obtaining data to be able to target the support where you thought it was needed, together with redeploying and recruiting people to build up that adult social care side of the team. Is that right? Exactly
correct. So in the early part of the pandemic, some of my conversations with the senior civil servants in the department, and particularly the director at the time, Ros Rowton, was how can we make sure that we've got the people to be able to respond to social care's needs. And the team that we had was kind of working round the clock to support social care. And so one of the early things was, well, how can we build up that team with people with capabilities, either from outside the civil service or from other departments? So that was one of the early things. And how do we structure it so that it shifts from being a group of people who focus on policy to a group of people with an area with operational oversight, coupled with, because of the nature of social care, with around 25,000 different care providers, and they're not managed from the centre. In fact, the majority are privately run organisations. To the extent that there's a contractual relationship with care providers, that will be held by local authorities who are commissioning their services. So that very disparate system. And the department didn't, for instance, have a list of all of those care providers where the data existed was with CQC, to the extent that they had the data of all the CQC registered care providers. So in fact, that's not the entirety of the care sector. There are also care providers who are not CQC registered if they're not providing what's described as personal care. You'll also have people who employ their own care worker directly. You'll have unpaid carers who we considered part of the sort of care system, so to speak, supported housing, shared lives. There are many different models. So it's a hugely varied sector. As I said, in the centre, we didn't have kind of a list of everybody who was involved in it to reach out to.
So a complex landscape and a small team that you had to build at speed.
Yes. The other thing, which is probably helpful context, because I think certainly for me it's been helpful in preparation for this inquiry, looking back at my diary and messages around that time, is actually in the initial few weeks after I was appointed on February the 13th, first went into the department on the 14th. And in that early time, there was a lot of business as usual going on in government, that the view was, well, the pandemic might or might not really come to the UK. And if it does, well, we're very well prepared for a pandemic. That was very much the briefings we were receiving. The consensus was the UK was one of the best prepared countries in the world. And my job when first appointed as a minister was to deliver on our manifesto commitments, most conspicuously, for instance, having 50,000 more nurses in the NHS and taking forward social care charging reform. And so if I look at my diary at that time, those are things that I'm spending significant amounts of time on, along with business as usual in Parliament, like going and speaking in debates, in Westminster Hall debates in the Chamber. So there was a lot else going on. And then it's clear from my records that then as we get into March, it does really start ramping up on the pandemic. But there still were also other things going on that ministers and other officials had to manage as well.
In respect of pandemic planning for the adult social care, your concerns arose quite quickly, didn't they? Mm-hmm. You say, just by way of background, the responsibility for pandemic planning for adult social care was seen to lie with local authorities, as opposed to the department, presumably.
Yeah, so this was one of the things that I started asking questions about as you know, given the risk that the pandemic would hit us in that way, and my responsibilities is, well, you know, who's responsible for what for social care, and how is this going to work? And the initial understanding and advice I was given was very much that local authorities would be leading the response for social care because they were the organisations that had the relationship with care providers, and in legislation, for instance, in the Care Act 2014, that sort of sets out the local authority role, while the department's role for social care is much more to do with, you know, oversight and policy, and then some oversight of local authorities performing the statutory duties. But yeah, so very much the expectation was that local authorities would be the lead organisation. And in fact, looking back at some of the record in the early conversations, for instance, about how PPE should get to social care, again, you can see the records that was expected to be, to some extent, social care providers continuing to get it from their wholesalers, but the local authorities very much being the point of contact. And this is not to attribute blame, it's just to kind of explain how the situation evolved. And then there came a point, which you may well come to, where I took a view in the centre, hold on, we need to do this differently.
Yes, absolutely.
Really, can I ask you to slow down? I'm sorry, like many of us, me included, you speak quite quickly, and I'm just worried about the stenographer.
I will do my best.
You say this about the plans for pandemic planning. You say the small number of plans I saw showed that the local authorities, you've explained where that lay, but they looked in turn to care providers to have their own plans. But I don't believe that local authorities in general check those plans, nor did I identify any Public Health England process for assuring themselves of the pandemic preparedness of care providers. Is that right?
So this is true, and again, I don't want to attribute blame, and some of what you're referring to is taken from my WhatsApp messages at the time, which are the records of many of the conversations I've seen myself, for instance, the Secretary of State for MHCLG at the time, Robert Jenrick, and also the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, at the time. And you can see from our messages, and I recall the conversations, where we wanted to assure ourselves that given that, as I described the role of local authorities, we wanted to be assured that they were ready to support social care and care homes and domiciliary care through the what was coming. And so one of the things that I wanted to see was, I said, I want to see those pandemic plans, because until I've seen one, how will I know that it's any good?
Yes.
And it was quite a struggle to get them.
Yes, if we just pause there briefly, I'll give you absolutely a chance to give your full evidence there, but if we just look briefly at one passage of those messages you've referred to, it's INQ 000475068. Ms Waitley, these are WhatsApp messages between you and the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, which you've very helpfully provided to the inquiry and referred to. On the 3rd of March, we can see there in the evening, Mr Hancock sends a message to you saying lots of questions about how social care will cope with COVID-19. Are you on it? And your response, very soon afterwards, I'm chasing it. Have got hold of what I'm told are 2 local authority plans, Herts and Essex. My opinion is that they are inadequate. I've asked for someone to brief me tomorrow on a plan for getting these and other plans into shape. Shortly afterwards, you say, was literally just about to message you to flag my concerns. And moving on a bit, you say the Essex doc says providers are required by the CQC to have plans in place to provide safe care in the event of a pandemic. And during a flu pandemic, directors of adult social services need to know the effectiveness of providers' plans, emerging risk and capacity to meet their demand. That's basically it, their plan. Mr Hancock replies, can you possibly put some serious drive into getting them into a credible position? The Chief Medical Officer tells me there's guidance to social care being developed to publish. Seems to me that we need to do a lot of work here. Your response, yes, absolutely. It's taken a week to even get these 2 example plans and to get a meeting in the diary with the Chief Social Worker tomorrow. You are right, it needs a rocket under it. And Mr Hancock replies with a rocket emoji. Much as you said, you summarise this in your statement. There didn't appear to be a plan in place to make sure care providers will be able to supply their staff with PPE in the event of a pandemic. Is that right?
Yes, that is true. So, I mean, as set out in that message, that I think brings to life the experience at the time, looking at those 2 plans, which were so hard to get hold of. And when I looked at them, I said, this doesn't really look like a plan. Whether it's to the extent that they did articulate some local authority responsibility and sense of their responsibility, or looking to the care provider and saying, well, we expect you guys to have a plan. But neither was particularly robustly established, including, therefore, no detailed plan of that level, how PPE would be distributed.
Yes, you summarise it like this in your witness statement. Care providers were expected to have their own stocks of PPE available. The national PPE supply was officially for NHS and social care, but you say you don't believe material work had been done to work out how to distribute PPE to social care providers from that stock in the event of a pandemic. Is that right?
Yes. So in the early days, I remember receiving the reassurances that the UK is very well prepared for the pandemic, and part of that is we have our national stock of PPE, and I wanted to be assured that wasn't just for the NHS, that was for social care as well, and I recall being told, yes, it was for the NHS and social care, there is a national stock. What became clear then when I started hearing from care providers that they were not getting the PPE they needed, didn't have the PPE they needed, was that there was a problem with getting that PPE to them. And one of the things that in fact transpired is the difficulty of distributing from, I think, the single national warehouse actually to the around 25,000 different care providers. And that was one reason why one of the things that we did early on in the pandemic was a drop of face masks to every single care provider, which I know has come under some criticism because it was insufficient for larger care providers, and some providers said they didn't get their stock, but it was in the circumstances a reaction. We've got to get something out there, and this is a way of doing it.
I'll be asking you some questions about that aspect shortly, but just to sort of conclude this aspect of preparedness, you've arrived in the job really with the pandemic looming. You've been briefed that pandemic readiness is there, but the plans you found are not adequate, and you've already spotted, have you, these potential issues around PPE supply. Reflecting on it, do you think on a national level that the Department for Health and Social Care should have been responsible for preparedness for a pandemic within the adult social care sector? Do you think that's something looking forward that should be the case?
So I think, so one of the things I think that's important is for there to be clarity about who is going to be responsible for what. And then to the extent that at any level there is responsibility, including, for instance, responsibilities of local authorities or indeed care providers themselves, then some system of assurance that actually, where a plan is needed, that plan has been made. Because I think that was part of the problem, is there was an expectation at many levels that there would be plans, but I haven't seen any evidence that it was anyone's job to go and check that those plans existed. I don't know, you could have a system in which every care provider would have some kind of plan. I recognise the burdens on them, the difficulties, the challenges they face, and then, as part of a CQC assurance process, to assure that there is some kind of plan there. And there's always a balance between the cost and regulatory burden and that. But given that what we found is we believed there would be plans and there weren't, a system for making sure that plans existed would be worthwhile. What should be done at different levels, and to what extent national versus local, again, is something that is worth thinking through. You won't necessarily have the same answer for everything, but certainly what felt to be the case, and at the point at which I realised or felt that there weren't a set of local authority plans and the system wasn't ready at the front line, I took a view in discussion with the Health Secretary, we are going to need to do this from the centre. And it very much felt everybody was also looking to government at the centre to take charge. In other countries, things might work differently, but in this country, people do look to the government to take hold of things. And I think that expectation would most likely remain.
Just before we get to that aspect, the taking charge, one other aspect that you referred to in your statement about the preparedness and the task that faced you is about data and the availability of data. These are your words. You say early on in March of 2020, you identified that there was a stark lack of data from the social care sector to inform your pandemic response. Is that right?
Yes.
You say particularly a lack of timely data on COVID-19 cases and deaths, and access to PPE was one of those parts of the data that was absent. So
gaps in data, I mean, we didn't have a list of care providers. We were able to go to CQC and they for the registered care providers, but that took time to establish. Then, one of the very early challenges was not having timely information about the number of COVID cases. So I was saying, have we got COVID in care homes? I'm hearing rumours. I'm looking at the news, and I can see, for instance, in countries like Spain, that many people were dying in care homes. Wanting to know what's going on in England, my responsibility, and not having the data about COVID cases, then not having data about COVID deaths. And in fact, I can see in the records that there was a point in April where we started getting that data, but I remember some really quite robust conversations, shall I say, between me and the public health colleagues, saying, I need to have the data about how this is hitting care homes and where. And then also, yes, PPE, one of the problems of, I'm hearing from stakeholders about the PPE shortages, and we know very well both, I should say, the shortage in the NHS as well as social care. But how bad is it? Is it comprehensive? Is it everywhere, or is it just some places? And not having the data at the very beginning of the pandemic in order to be able to focus supplies was also a challenge.
You, if I may say, have conveyed that in your answer, but you do say in your statement you were extremely concerned about the lack of data. In terms of addressing that, you say you commissioned work which led to the development of a new data tool for the Department for Health and Social Care, which was to prove central to the response ultimately to COVID-19. It was something that became called the capacity tracker, the adult social care capacity tracker. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, this was something I personally very specifically commissioned because of this frustration. How could we effectively respond without data which told us what was going on at the front line? And I remember civil servants going on a mission to look at what was there that we could work with, and identifying something called the capacity tracker, which was already used in part of the country between social care and the NHS to establish availability of places in care homes. In essence, an Excel spreadsheet that was used to store that data inputted by care providers, and we decided that was the best system to build up to become a national set of data, and to add the fields to it that, for instance, included access to PPE, COVID cases, deaths, and over time we added additional information to it of staffing. Actually, one of the important things, one of the particular worries early in the pandemic was what would happen to social care staffing, reflecting, for instance, that we saw in Spain, very sadly, people died in care homes, not necessarily COVID, but because all the staff left and there was no one to look after care home residents, and she died of neglect. That was one of the biggest worries at the early stage of the pandemic, is how would we make sure there would be staff? We didn't have that situation in this country, for which, my gratefulness to the social care staff who stuck there. But that was, it's just as context, that was actually one of the biggest worries early on. Anyway, we built up the capacity tracker, and it became something that I looked at every day, and we used it to also gain a greater understanding, for instance, of what was driving COVID rates, and it became a very useful tool.
Focusing on access to PPE, in terms of how that came into this capacity tracker, you say that was something that was developed and built up over time. By when, in your recollection, was the capacity tracker providing the kind of visibility on PPE supplies and shortages that you thought you would need to drive the response?
Yes, and I know this. I know that in my statement I say the capacity tracker was up and running in June, at which point we had 98% of care providers filling it in regularly. Though actually we started using it earlier than that, and checking the corporate statement for this module. In April it starts providing us information that we're using, and I noted that we were using that to brief the Prime Minister in May on the situation. So it started providing us useful information at some point during April. I don't have the exact date. We built it up into May, and by June it was properly established.
So that's the capacity tracker. It's giving you that visibility by the June, is it, on PPE?
On PPE. So yes, and we had a system that a care provider could say if they were about to run out of PPE, for instance, they didn't have enough stock to last, for instance, 48 hours or so. It was dependent clearly on care providers filling it in accurately, and there's a range of capabilities in the sector to, for instance, do that. But in general, we did use it, and we'd used it, for instance, to inform the PPE distribution system of where we saw there were shortages. Can they go out and address those?
All right. Well, that's what I want to look at now. Some of the ways you say you sought to address the challenges of getting emergency channels of supply into the care sector. You've talked vividly, if I may say, about the reports you were hearing in March of 2020 about concerns and shortages of PPE in the NHS and care sector, I presume.
Yes.
You say the reports included not just that, but also concerns that something called the National Supply Distribution Response Hotline, that was something I think that DHSC put in place in March of 2020 to respond to care providers who had an urgent need. Is that right?
That was across health and social care.
Health and social care, yeah. You say in your statement in March there were concerns that hotline was being overwhelmed with calls. Was that a justified concern? Did that hotline become overwhelmed?
That is what I heard from the care providers. I wasn't operating the hotline, therefore I can't give you the view of the hotline operators. No,
but that's what you heard from the sector.
But that is certainly what I heard from the sector. That, and in terms of how the system worked. So at first, the social care sector was pointed towards getting their PPE from their usual wholesalers. Then there was a system of pointing towards local resilience forums, essentially local authority groups, to get PPE. And then we move on to the PPE portal, the Clipper system, which I'm sure you'll come to. But in the sort of first two phases of that, the backup was to access the national hotline and the national stockpile which was the NHS and social care. And indeed, I did hear frustration from social care providers about them not managing to get stock from that, though I raised that with officials, for instance, the relevant Director General, Jonathan Marin, who I know has given evidence to this inquiry already, and was assured that that service was responding to social care providers, although they weren't able to give me the data saying what had been distributed to social care providers.
Can we look, please, at another message? This is in early April between you and Mr. Hancock. It's INQ 000 475 068. So we're now on the 5th of April. You messaged Mr. Hancock to say, please can I have someone in the supplies team dedicated to overseeing PPE to social care? It is still all over the place. They've sent me contradictory info in recent days and cannot answer questions about flow. I'm also told Clipper system looks NHS focused. And again, no one can tell me whether it will cope with 20,000 social care providers ordering stock day one. There's only so long I can keep saying to the social care sector we're working on it without losing all credibility. Just unpacking that somewhat, you were asking for someone who would focus, I think, a dedicated person to focus on PPE supplies and social care. It might be obvious. Why are you asking for that?
So one of my worries was that while the national stockpile was intended for distribution to the NHS and social care, I felt that more of the people involved in it were from the NHS side. It was being run out of NHS England. There was greater understanding in general of how the NHS works, NHS supply chains, getting PPE to hospitals, compared to I was concerned less knowledge of how the social care system worked, the fact that you had so many thousands of different care providers, big ones, small ones, and the complexity. So I was asking at that point that could somebody be in the room who would really understand the social care bit of it, so that social care wasn't let down because of somebody just not knowing how it worked relative to that knowledge about the NHS.
Did you get that person?
So one of the things that happened was David Pearson, who subsequently chaired our Adult Social Care Task Force, he had an involvement in being a voice for social care behind the scenes then. Also, some of these conversations were with Jonathan Marin, who'd previously been the Director General with oversight of social care, so he did have knowledge of the social care system, and I was very much assured that social care was being considered during that. Then we went on to the second part of the comment you've referred to, is about the Clipper system.
Yes.
And again, you could see me at first saying, well, this looks like they've got it all worked out for the NHS. I would say in response to some of that...
Just pausing there, I'll absolutely
it.
let you make this point. No, not at all, but just so we're all clear, ladies clear as well, when you're talking about the Clipper system, so you've asked for this person to be dedicated to social care PPE supply, you then refer to the Clipper system. Is that shorthand for what became the online portal for the health and social care sectors to order PPE stocks?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And when we see Clipper, that's the logistics company that was engaged to run that?
I think so. It was just the colloquial terminology we were
shorthand.
using then was people were calling it the Clipper system. But yes, it was a PPE portal, and which, as I'm saying here, my concern was it looks like they've worked out how they're going to get it to the NHS, and I was pushing on the social care side.
Yes.
It did get developed for social care, and actually I think they did a very good job of doing that. It took a little while to ramp up, but actually I think the work on it started in April, and within a matter of weeks of that, it was distributing to a significant number of care providers. And during the course of the summer and by the autumn, it was getting very large volumes of PPE out to thousands and thousands of care providers. And the feedback I got from care providers over that time was that once it was up and running, it actually was a good system. And if you consider how long people think things take in government, it was probably quite a remarkable thing to get that going that quickly, even though at the time, for me and working with care homes, it all felt like you wanted everything to go quicker.
Yes.
It all felt too slow.
I do just want, you've sort of completed the circle, as it were. So by the time the Clipper system is up and running, you say in your statement, and you've just told us you believe it worked well, and by the winter of 2020 to 2021, you say, I can't remember receiving many complaints from providers about the distribution of PPE, and you say that the capacity tracker by then was showing that most suppliers did in fact have PPE.
Yes.
I want to just ask you in a little bit more detail about the development of it, and as you've alluded to there, the time that it took. At one point, as you were building this up, and you've alluded to this as well, there was an emergency drop of PPE, wasn't there? This was the 4th of April
Yes.
by DHSC and the Ministry of Housing, Community and Local Government of a number of items of PPE to, was this right, every CQC registered care home?
Yes.
That was to be done through the local resilience forums, which I think you've said are multi-agency partnerships made up of representatives from local public services, including the NHS and others.
So the initial distribution of it was 7 million face masks to 26,000 care providers. I don't believe that was done through the local resilience forums.
Okay.
I think that was organised more directly by the national stockpile system.
All right. But that was the idea was 300 masks and other items to every CQC registered. Is that?
Yes, which was done because it was face masks that were the particular issue, in part, and I remember receiving this advice from my officials at the time, because care providers would tend to have a good stock of gloves and aprons and things like that, but were less likely to have face masks because they didn't use them so much day to day. So that was the particular challenge. So and I remember discussing, well, could we not do something more sophisticated with more face masks to the bigger organisations, clearly, and was advised and agreed with the approach, which was actually a more sophisticated approach would take much longer and it's going to be very hard to do. So actually, at this point, let's just do something that we can do.
Yes.
And this is what was therefore done.
I want to look just briefly at some of the challenges this did create. Can I please bring up INQ 000 517 172? Thank you. This is a briefing by civil servants within the Ministry of Local Government regarding the rollout of the PPE portal being, as it says, being developed by DHSC. This is dated the 15th of May, so we're some weeks on now from that initial drop, as you've said. And can you see where it says context? Halfway down the page. Drops to local resilience forums have become the main distribution route for emergency PPE supplies since the first deliveries at the start of April. The continuation of what was originally intended to be a one-off drop has put strain on our relationships, that's presumably the Ministry of Housing, the Ministry of Local Government, on our relationships with local resilience forums and local authorities, poses a threat of reputational damage to the government that falls on the local government ministry and carries significant operational risk. Additionally, as local resilience forums turn their attention to restart, it's essential that their resource capability is used as effectively as possible. DHSC had expected their PPE portal to be operational by mid-May. They have confirmed that local resilience forums will continue to be the main route for emergency supplies until the PPE portal is fully operational. DHSC have indicated that they may complete the rollout by mid-June. Just asking about that, do you recognise some of those challenges which seem to be flagged up here by the local government department?
Yes, so I know that ministers in MHCLG, the local government department, were hearing from LRFs about how difficult LRFs were finding it, and also the challenge for LRFs to make sure that they had PPE in a situation where there were general widespread shortages, as we know, for supplying the NHS, supplying social care, and clearly globally, not just a situation that the UK faced. So there was a supply challenge. And I also know that LRFs were being asked to provide PPE, not just to for instance, social care, but to many different organisations and sectors that wanted to have PPE and had an expectation for it, even though there was clearly the general shortage.
I want to bring up briefly, please, a witness statement of Penelope Hobman, who's the director of the COVID-19 response unit at the Ministry of Housing and Local Communities and Local Government. It's INQ 0005 38191. If you look at paragraph, it should be on the screen there for you. If you look at paragraph 163, so we've seen where it got to we've had the drop in April. We've seen where it got to in May. Here we are at June, according to the Local Government Ministry. During June, it says, the department continued to relay concerns to DHSC from LRFs, particularly about the shifting timelines of the full PPE portal rollout. And then it references here an early meeting in June, 2nd of June, between you and the Minister Simon Clarke for social care. Don't want to press you for specifics, but just in terms of that time, and we're now in June, were you still hearing that kind of concern about the timescale for the rollout of the PPE portal?
So, I mean, yes, as evidenced by the fact that Simon sought a meeting with me and we talked about it. There were clearly still demands coming through from the front line and through local authorities for PPE. So that was likely not only care providers but also others who wanted PPE. I remember that being a factor in the situation.
And if we could just go up, please, to page 7 of the same document. This is paragraph 17. So this is still Ms. Hobman's statement. Referring to the April drop in the last sentence of this paragraph here, she says, following this drop, LRFs still reported shortages and a series of subsequent drops followed, with this eventually becoming the main route by which LRFs receive PPE through weekly drops, taking place until September of 2020. And then the next paragraph, please, paragraph 18. This is the sentence I wanted to ask you about. The portal was not fully operational until September of 2020. Is that right? Does that accurately reflect your...
So my recollection is it gradually ramped up both the number of providers and the size of the orders they could make and what items of PPE they could order. There will be somewhere a timeline that says the number of providers that were accessing it as of May, June, July. I just remember it ramping up. One of the things that I recall doing was pushing to say, well, can you ramp up faster? And also, can you make sure that you are allowing providers to order the sufficient volume? Because I think some of them said to me that the problem is we can't get enough volume off it or enough PPE sort of in advance. So it took time to get there.
Just turning up very briefly, please. INQ 000 574 777. This is the witness statement of the Care Provider Alliance. If we look at, at page 8, where it says in March 2020. So we can see that in March 2020, DHSC provided 300 face masks to each CQC registered care provider. What said there is far from enough to support the response to the pandemic or operationalise guidance. I mean, I'm assuming you've said it was sort of the best.
That was the point, that it was a best efforts,
Yeah.
as I said, and not enough for larger providers.
Questions by Care Provider Alliance colleagues quickly arose regarding the appropriate timing for mask usage and what other types of masks could offer staff protection. Guidance on addressing these inquiries was issued by Public Health England in early autumn 2020, several months after the distribution of masks. This followed months of engagement by the Care Provider Alliance with the Department of Health and Social Care PPE task and finish groups. And then this, PPE supplies continued to be slow to get to the sector throughout the first wave and the summer and autumn of 2020. However, the Care Provider Alliance continued to work with and advise DHSC on the launch of the portal from the spring and summer. The launch date was May 2020. However, access to this portal for the entire sector took a significant amount of time. Non-CQC registered providers were unable to access PPE from the portal initially, and therefore were directed back to the local resilience fora. The level of support from the LRFs was inconsistent across the country. From your recognition in March of how bad you were hearing things were, through to the build-up of the capacity tracker, and that's iterative, isn't it? It's you're adding fields and you're getting the data back, to the emergency drops through the LRF and the challenges that posed, and what seems to be finally this becoming operational by September 2020. Did that timeline cause you any concern or frustration?
I mean, yes. From the initial drop, as I said, I wanted to do something which was much more comprehensive and essentially more sophisticated, giving care providers the volume that they required. But the reality was, in the early stage of the pandemic, we both didn't have the systems, the ability to have a more sophisticated distribution to care providers. And of course, there was also that shortage of actual stock. Hence, there were stories, whether it was in social care or in the NHS, of staff kind of finding their own PPE and finding other ways of getting hold of it. So clearly, I was frustrated and wanted us to do better, but there was a constraint, was the reality of both the system and the quantity of stock. I do think, and looking at this, and I clearly read it in advance, the point about the guidance is there was guidance on the use of, infection prevention and control, IPC, earlier than the autumn, including the use of PPE, because I remember having, and I looked at it much earlier than that, some of the guidance, to try and make sure that it was clear for care staff how to use PPE effectively. I think one of the things that this extract flags is, again, the situation with CQC versus non-CQC registered, where the portal was set up and worked better for providers that were registered with CQC, who were giving personal care and therefore known to need PPE. The situation was harder with providers that weren't CQC registered, therefore not giving personal care, because by law, if you're giving personal care, you're in the sense of sort of physical personal care, you're required to be CQC registered. And therefore, at the centre, it wasn't possible to know which of those organisations did actually really need PPE or not. Hence, that was one reason for it being delegated more locally, is at a local authority level, those staff would be better placed to judge whether organisation A really needed PPE or wanted it, but actually, given that there was a shortage of supply, shouldn't be receiving it because they weren't doing close contact care.
In those crucial early months of such difficulty and such high demand for PPE, do you think that a lack of preparedness and or a lack of proper data contributed to a delay in the ability of providers to access PPE through the portal by the time it was set up?
The fact that we didn't have sufficient stocks and the issues with the central logistics in terms of the difficulty they had actually getting the stock out the door, and I heard literally one of the problems was this one door situation, coupled with the fact that I don't think there'd been any testing of and working out in advance of, well, how would we get PPE out to many thousands of care providers? So that had to be worked out in real time. Had those things been worked out in advance, we would have been in a better position, albeit clearly one of the fundamental constraints was the supply.
Yes.
So you might have hit that bottleneck even if you had all the systems up and running.
Just want to move briefly, please, to another matter. and this is about the cost of PPE to the care sector. You say, this is your paragraph 136, you say that early on in the pandemic, care providers flagged the high cost of PPE to you at the department as one of the problems they faced. Mm-hmm. You say that's why I argued for PPE funding for social care from the Treasury. I didn't want to see staff or people receiving care put at risk because their employer couldn't afford it. How was that concern ultimately addressed, the cost aspect of PPE?
So, yeah, that's correct. So one of the challenges, and it's no secret about the financial pressures on care providers, and one of the things I heard from providers was how expensive this is. All it is, both the increased volume of PPE needed and prices going up for PPE they were securing from wholesalers. Therefore, together with the Health Secretary, was lobbying the Treasury for funding for social care. There was early in the pandemic some funding distributed to local government, which was intended in part to go on through to care providers. However, care providers were telling me that they didn't get a material share from that funding. That's why we created what's called the Infection Control Fund, which was a completely new method of getting funding to care providers. The government had no established way of directly funding care providers. We've since legislated to enable that to happen should it be needed in future, but at the time it didn't exist, so this was a difficult thing for the Treasury, quite understandably, because they have to be careful of taxpayers' money. And during the pandemic, I recall right, over £1 billion was distributed through that fund to the care sector for use on a range of things, including extra staffing costs, but also to support, say, with PPE costs.
Yes.
However, through the portal, as you'll know, that then became a method of giving PPE completely free to the sector, so that cost was not a barrier at all.
Yes, so you say this Social Care Infection Fund, introduced in May of 2020, extended in October 2020. By March, it was providing 1.1 billion of ring-fenced funding for the sector.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So it's substantial, and I did hear from the sector that made a really big
Yes, if we bring up INQ 000513190, the witness statement of Melanie Weatherly, Director of the Care Association Alliance, paragraph 3.1, forgive me, 3.3, she says this: it's difficult to overestimate the impact of making PPE available to the care sector at no cost, and more importantly, in a reliable way. This enabled care providers, particularly small and medium-sized care providers, to be reassured that they could meet their IPC responsibilities. So,
yes,
a dip sample, but one organisation telling us exactly that. This made a really significant difference. Did that reflect your
Yes, I mean, I heard from many providers that when we had the system up and running and working and providing PPE for free at no cost, then that made a great difference to them. One of the things in my notes says that the portal distributed 1.8 billion PPE items to adult domiciliary care, so home care, and nearly 2.7 billion items to residential care. To just give a sense of the scale, I mean, it was a huge operation. So clearly there was a frustration. We talked about the pace, but it was actually a huge operation in terms of scale and quantity of PPE. And as it says here, and I heard that generally, particularly come the winter and the second wave, care providers said they, for the vast majority of the time, they had the PPE that they needed.
Just to complete this paragraph, what Ms Weatherly says is it wasn't the cost of the additional PPE that was the main concern, but the general lack of availability, the challenges in sourcing correct sizes, and the variability in quality. Do you recognise those as challenges that remained?
I mean, definitely, and particularly in the early part, amongst the challenges was, well, is this PPE up to the job? There were concerns about PPE being out of date. There was one particular exchange about some distribution PPE stocks that had a label that said they were out of date. I remember going back and investigating and being told, no, those have been sort of retested and they are good to use. But understandably, the organisations that had received that PPE with an older label on were really worried about whether it was okay to use. So quality was one of the concerns, as well as general supply.
a theme of your witness statement, which is obviously to be published in full, and if I may say a theme of your evidence today, is that you personally, and possibly officials around you, were having to lobby quite hard to achieve any sense of parity or prioritisation, to use your word, for the care sector within procurement of these things like PPE, key things like PPE. Does that reflect your experience?
Yes, and it's something that I reflect on and try and unpick. You know, how much is, unsurprisingly, the experience of as a minister representing a sector, you know, whether it's in a pandemic or in normal time, you lobby on behalf of your sector and you're always fighting their corner. And it wouldn't be uncommon for a minister to feel, oh, well, my area is not getting the attention it needs, because if you're lobbying a Secretary of State, they've got a much wider brief, or the Prime Minister's considering a lot of things, so you're always going to fight your corner. But the thing that I was certainly conscious of, as I said at the beginning, is the difference for social care and the NHS in terms of both the sort of the quantity of people with experience in working in that sector, and also the extent to which I guess they were or weren't in the room. So you know, the NHS had the power of NHS England and Simon Stevens as the chief executive, and it's a well-established relationship with Prime Minister Treasury Number 10, and social care didn't have the same place in government, and government didn't have historically the same responsibilities in the same way for social care. Therefore, I felt, yes, I was fighting every step of the way for social care.
Everyone's fighting their corner, but we're in a pandemic now. These are very vulnerable residents, aren't they, often? Very vulnerable workers from different backgrounds and all the rest. Did social care ever achieve the proper prioritisation within the procurement of supplies? And as well as that, can you reflect on how that might be achieved looking forward in the event of anything in the future?
So on procurement specifically, I don't think I would see a disparity, because the same sort of items we needed in healthcare as in social care. So my focus or thoughts would be more on distribution. If you have evidence to the contrary, then I guess I wasn't at all close to procurement anyway. On distribution, and one of the concerns I had at the time and have expressed is whether people really understood social care. So was social care in the room? Were there people there arguing for social care, you know, considering that there were definitely voices in the room for the NHS where people arguing the same way for social care if I wasn't in the room. In fact, one of the reasons why I asked for the director for social care at the time, Ross Roughton, for that to become a Director General role, was because I thought if we had a Director General dedicated to social care, then you would have somebody in the room in certain meetings who the sole thing they were speaking up for was social care. I also worked to get a new role of chief nurse for social care, again, to give another voice for social care, particularly for the social care workforce. So some of what I did was getting voices of social care in the room. I do feel from the conversations that I had with many people, as I've mentioned, whether it was Jonathan Marron, Emily Lawson, or clearly the Health Secretary, you know, social care was being thought about. Although I have read something from, it's an NAO report, which therefore there's some issues with referring to that, but that indicates that in some parts of the system, people believed that social care had other routes for getting PPE, for instance. So I think some of the problem was to do with understanding the system and believing that there was a different answer for social care when, in fact, for instance, the national supply system was meant to be there supporting social care.
Lady, thank you. Those are my questions. There are some others.
Could I just before I ask the, I think Mr Weatherby's going first. You've said a number of times that you were being told about concerns from the care sector, but from care providers. How are you getting that information? Was that coming from your constituents? Was it coming from briefings from your officials? How are you? You obviously were being told what was going on the ground somehow. How did you do that?
It's a good question, and I get through multiple channels. So when I joined the Department of Health as Minister, there were already very well established stakeholder communication forums between officials and the care sector. In my early briefings as a new minister, I had introductions to some of the key representatives, organisations like the CPA, whose statement is here, and Nadra, who's a fantastic advocate, Vic Rain, another person who was a great advocate. So I got to meet some of the representatives of the sector. And officials would give me briefings as well as me, and I increasingly established having my own direct calls. So I had regular virtual meetings with representatives. Also, I'd have other sources. Clearly, I had care providers in my own constituency who would be contacting my office. Other MPs would contact me saying they'd heard from care providers. Obviously, you could read the media, and occasionally I would get a direct contact from a care provider as well. So multiple sources to form a picture of what was going on.
Thank you very much. It is you, Mr. Willoughby.
Thank you. Good morning. I ask just a few questions on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice group, which represents about 7,000 bereaved family members, many of whom were lost in care homes or under adult social care, and some of whom worked, and some of the bereaved still work in adult social care. So just two short topics from me. Mr. Stoat referred you to one of your WhatsApp messages from the 5th of April, and I just want to put up on screen INQ 000569777, page 15, please, which is the published diaries of Mr. Hancock, and the entry for the date that Mr. Stoat was asking about, which was the 5th of April. And presumably from the WhatsApp and other contact with you on that date, and again, presumably a contemporaneous diary entry, Mr. Hancock records this: a cri de coeur from Helen Waitley, who is under massive pressure over PPE shortages in care homes. Quote, "It is still all over the place," she said. Apparently, she is getting contradictory information from officials who can't seem to answer any questions about supplies. And again, he quotes, "There is only so long I can keep saying to the social care sector that we're working on it without losing all credibility," unquote, she said miserably. "I promised to do everything I can." So is that an accurate account from your recollection of your contact with Mr. Hancock at that time?
Yes, and that diary entry is referring to the same exchange that Mr. Stoat spoke about earlier ago. So it is, and I also have it in front of me, so it is pretty accurate.
Yes, so it conveys the depth of concern from you at that point.
Yes, it does.
Yeah. Can I put up another document, which is INQ 000083702? And can we start at page 1, please? And this is a minute of the Health Ministerial Implementation Group meeting just 2 days later on the 7th of April. And from page 1, I'm not sure it's up in front of you, I hope it is. It should be on the screen.
The front pages, yes.
Yeah, okay, good. And that's chaired by Mr. Hancock. And there's a number of senior ministers there and representatives from each of the devolved administrations and a number of other people, including senior civil servants. And the minutes of this meeting show that Matt Hancock chaired it, but you provided an update regarding social care. And I'm not going to take you through all of it, but on page 4, if we could just have a look at page 4, Mr. Hancock introduces the meeting and it's a review of the current situation of adult social care. And then you provide an update and you refer to PPE a number of times, but without mentioning the concerns that you'd raised in such stark terms 2 days earlier. So, for example, in the second paragraph, your first paragraph, there's a reference about halfway down, RAG ratings across admission status. RAG ratings, that's red, amber, green, I presume. RAG ratings across admission status, workforce and PPE were being collected from care homes and could potentially be shared with local authorities, etc. And then the bottom paragraph on that page, again from you, the Minister said that ensuring parity is the approach between NHS and social care for PPE and testing was important. PPE was being delivered to social care providers from national stocks, and they could contact the National Supply Disruption Response Hotline in emergencies, and etc. Looking at this minute, there's no reflection at all of the degree of concern that you had at that time, is there?
I would agree that the minute does not reflect that.
Yeah.
So is that meaning that the minute is not completely full because you weren't responsible for it being prepared, or are you saying that you didn't reflect it in what you said?
The problem is going back to the 7th of April 5 years ago, nearly. I cannot be sure what I exactly said in that meeting and whether I did or didn't articulate some of the challenges and the minute doesn't reflect that, or whether it was the formality of the meeting meant that I just gave a update on the process that was meant to happen. Unfortunately, I don't have a more detailed record of it.
Sorry to interrupt, Mr. Rutherford.
No, that's very helpful, thank you. Okay, but I mean, I've started the question by orienting it to the 5th of April and the cri de coeur, and this is very shortly afterwards. So it would be a surprise, wouldn't it, if the minutes were wrong and you had actually expressed the level of disquiet that you'd expressed to Mr. Hancock?
I don't want to suggest that the minutes are wrong, but the situation is that I don't have a more detailed record of exactly what was or wasn't said in that meeting.
Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, if the minute is right, the effect of it would be that the other senior ministers, the devolved administration, other senior people from the civil service and different departments, they would all have left that meeting with a wrong impression of what was going on, wouldn't they?
So I have no doubt that there were senior ministers who also knew at that time the challenges with PPE distribution. I had conversations with other ministers about it. So I think there was widespread awareness in government.
Yeah, okay.
About the PPE.
Was this actually an example of DHSC saving face across government with other ministers about what was actually going on with the ground?
As I said, the problem I have is beyond these minutes, I don't have a more detailed record of what was or wasn't said at that meeting.
My second point, moving on, supply to care homes. We know from the same statement that Mr. Stoke put to you from Penelope Hobman, I don't need to take you to it, I think, but we know from that statement, and just for the record, it's paragraph 127 from that statement, where we know that on the 13th of April, DHSC informed the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government that due to gowns and certain other items being in short supply, they wouldn't be provided in the next drop to local resilience forums, which, as you've described, would be distributing to social care sector. So by the 13th of April, that's an example, isn't it, of a serious problem arising with the lack of PPE.
Yeah, I remember there was, and that this may be right, there was a particular window when gowns became in desperately short supply across the system. And yeah, so there was a particular problem at a particular point in time with gowns. In general, the problem was more with face masks, I reckon.
Yes.
But there was a particular gowns crisis.
I'm just using it as an example of acute shortages, which led to simply no supply at various points during this period. By the 5th of May, there was a deep dive ministerial meeting on care homes, which acknowledged that the situation in care homes was a national emergency. Can we just put that up just to, so you can orient it? It's INQ 000 146701. And that meeting was chaired by Dominic Raab, who I think at that point would have been filling in for the Prime Minister.
Yes, when the Prime Minister...
when he was ill. And you were there, and again, senior ministers. So by that stage, there was a very clear understanding that the situation generally in care homes was a national emergency. That we get that from page 3. We can flick through bottom of page 3. And then if we could jump to page 8. And again, this is you, and it's towards the bottom of the page. It's the second to bottom paragraph. And you're explaining the problems. And the last sentence, you said that the biggest challenge for PPE in care homes was the supply, and there'd been ongoing discussions with Lord Dayton on this. So at this point, it's all out in the open. The general position in care homes was a national emergency, as described. You're setting out here in this ministerial meeting that there's a problem not only with distribution, but in fact with inadequate supply. And is it right that this is a problem that was evident in March, April, May, and continued through the first wave?
Yes, so I started hearing about problems with PPE in mid to late March, and challenges continued through into April and into May, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's all I ask.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Stanton. Mr. Stanton's over there. Sweetly.
Thank you, my lady. Good morning, Ms. Wortley.
Good morning.
I appear and ask questions on behalf of the British Medical Association. I have just one question which relates to a proposal to reduce levels of PPE. And the context is set out in part at paragraph 124 of your witness statement, which I don't think we need to bring up, but there you talk about the impact on health and care workers. You describe how some tragically lost their lives, others caught COVID-19 or living with the consequences of long COVID. And in the final sentence, you say, care workers and NHS staff looked to PPE to protect them from COVID-19, but in the early days when we faced shortages, like so many other countries, the PPE they needed wasn't always there to protect them. And I should say the BMA entirely agrees with your statement there. You also say at paragraph 49, and I think it might help if we bring this up on screen, although I can see you might have it within your paper bundle. This is at INQ 000535015 _0015. At paragraph 49, you talk about the downsides of PPE. You talk about discomfort and also some problems with people who have difficulties with hearing. And in the final sentence, you say, mitigating these disadvantages and looking at when/where we could safely reduce use of PPE, therefore also became objectives. And appreciating that you refer to the need to safely reduce PPE, this does nevertheless seem to be at odds with the priority of preventing infection from a deadly disease. And therefore, please can I ask, who set this objective? How was it implemented? And when did the implementation take place?
So what this reflects is conversations that I'd be having with care providers and indeed with staff when I did what's called virtual visits to care homes, and also actually family representatives of people receiving care homes and home care, who talked to me about the challenges they were finding with the use of PPE and the problems. So, for instance, for staff, the discomfort of wearing face masks for many, many hours, and the difficulties communicating with the people they cared for. So, whether that was working-age adults or, as people often will think of in care homes and nursing homes or home care, older people who may be hard of hearing, may be suffering with dementia, and therefore wearing a face mask makes communication much harder. Really hard for somebody who, for instance, relies on lip reading to understand, therefore somebody talking with a muffling of the face mask. And also individuals with dementia getting really upset and, what's going on? Why are these people surrounded me wearing masks, whether they could articulate that or not? And family members talking about that being a problem as well. So one of the things which I will have spoken to public health officials about is, well, how can we mitigate this negative impact that PPE is having? One of the things that we looked at and trialled was the use of clear masks, although those weren't very popular in practice. And one of the things I would have been asking is, well, no, when will it be safe for masks not to be used? So that reflects the problems that I was hearing, as I said, from the front line on the downside of masks.
Yes, thank you. Can I just quickly ask, did any downgrade actually occur?
Not in the sense of, we said downgrade, like moving to a less effective form of PPE. Not like that. So as I said, we trialled the use of clear masks, and was that an alternative? And then what you will see in published guidance was at various times there was a point at which the guidance will have said, well, you don't need to use so much PPE, though that was a long time later in my recollection when PPE stopped being used.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Melanie.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Mr. Thomas. Oh, no, it's Mr. Dale. Mr. Dale, they've misled me again. My apologies.
Thank you, my lady. Mrs. Waitley, I ask questions on behalf of FEMO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Organizations. And I just have two short topics. Firstly, at your paragraph 36, and you don't need to bring it up, I see that you have your paper bundle. You say, and I quote, "I identified early on in the pandemic, in March 2020, that there was a stark lack of data from the social care sector to inform our pandemic response, particularly a lack of timely data on COVID-19 cases and deaths, access to PPE, and availability of staff," end of quote. Now, I know you touched on this more generally with Mr. Stoats, but just to confirm, did this stark lack of data that you refer to also include data on race and ethnicity?
For instance, of staff, so we had very little data for social care staff in the sense of, because it's in general an unregistered profession. So, for instance, if you're a registered nurse, they have a register of all the nurses working in and registered to work in this country. You don't have the equivalent for social care other than some subsets like social workers, and therefore you don't have an official data set about the social care workforce. You have, for instance, broad numbers from Skills for Care. I know that I had an understanding that a significant proportion of the social care staff would be staff from ethnic minorities, as you say, but I wouldn't have accurate figures on who was working where. Right.
And having having an awareness of the difficulties as you've described it. Can you say what steps you took to address this issue? And I mean specifically as it regards procurement of PPE.
So I was not involved in the procurement of PPE. What I think is relevant to this is, as we learnt that people from some ethnicities were at greater risk from COVID, we took steps to try and mitigate that risk and make sure that staff were supported. As I said at the outset, I had oversight both of NHS workforce as well as social care. One of the things that the NHS did, working with the BMA, was a risk assessment framework that looked at the different risk levels of staff and expected all employers to consider the individual risk that any staff member faced. And we then got that adapted for the social care sector and required social care providers to adopt that framework and risk assess their staff.
Very well. At paragraph 54 of your statement, you wrote, quote, on 19th March 2020, my private office sent me an update on the supply of PPE in response to my concerns. The update confirmed that there were PPE shortages, end of quote. Did you also anticipate issues concerning suitability of PPE, especially as it regards those from ethnic minority backgrounds?
I don't believe at that time, or at least not in any advice that was sent to me, was there any suggestion that different staff would need different sorts of PPE, whether that was by gender or ethnicity. I don't remember it being a factor. The concern I remember at the time was just how can we get PPE out of any sort of PPE to the front line.
Next topic. You say at paragraph 65 that, quote, one of my concerns was that the national PPE supply, which was already struggling, was geared towards the NHS, end of quote. Mm-hmm. I should say that many FEMO members work in the social care sector, community health, or combine their paid employment with work as unpaid carers. So my question is, how did the structural separation between health and social care impact PPE supply and support for social care and community health organizations?
So I think I risk repeating some of what I've said earlier, where social care was meant to be able to access those supplies, and some supplies did go to social care from that national stockpile. However, I think there were greater challenges in getting it out to social care, particularly because of the nature of the social care sector. There are many thousands of different providers and potentially greater experience working with the NHS as well.
What accounts for government's failure to anticipate procurement needs outside the NHS?
Okay, that is a big question about the pandemic planning and the extent to which there had been effective planning for social care's needs as well as the NHS. And I think, why did there not seem to be a plan that was in place for social care? And I think this is one of the significant gaps, and I would imagine we will explore it more in the social care module to come, which is, although the view was that we were well prepared for a pandemic, in practice, it turned out we weren't didn't feel, certainly from my position, at least, that we were very well prepared to support social care. And I think also part of the problem being that to the extent we were prepared for a pandemic, it was for a flu pandemic rather than for what actually the COVID pandemic.
Very well. And finally from me, you say at paragraph 49 that as the pandemic progressed, I heard about PPE not being used effectively. Mm-hmm. Therefore, making sure PPE was used properly at all times in social care became an additional objective of the PPE policy, end of quote. Can you identify any policy that you developed in response to the issue of PPE and its suitability for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic workers?
So I recall when there started to be awareness of face masks, for instance, not fitting so well for staff of different ethnicities, or if staff had facial hair or beard, for instance, that there were discussions about what was the right kind of PPE or face mask for that. And I think that was particularly a case with some of the respirators that we used in the NHS. So I do recall that was an area that the public health teams were looking at to see what different PPE would be appropriate to be distributed to people when there was problems with fit. That applies for ethnicity, and also I think I heard from women saying that the PPE didn't fit them so well.
Thank you, Mrs. Waitley. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Dale. That completes our questions for you for this module. I've got a horrible feeling, Mrs. Waitley, I'm going to be calling on you again onto another module. So I do appreciate the burden that the inquiry places on people, especially busy people like you. So I'm really grateful to you for your help. I'm grateful for the attempts you made to raise the profile of care homes. I know you appreciated, obviously, the importance that that kind of raising a profile was to the residents or the recipients of social care and to their loved ones. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I shall return. I should give it slightly longer for a break. 1:45. All rise. Ms. Gardner.
My lady, the next witness is Sarah Collins.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
I hope you were told you weren't first on. The plan is to try and finish you before lunch, though, so even if that means taking a later lunch.
That's fine. Thank you.
Please state your full name for the inquiry.
Sarah Hogle Collins.
Thank you. You've provided a witness statement to the inquiry. It's 90 pages and it's signed and dated the 3rd of December in 2024. The INC ref is 000521972. Is that your witness statement?
That's correct.
And is that witness statement still true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Ms. Collins, I'd like to begin just by covering some of your professional background. You have been a civil servant since 2008, I believe.
Yes.
And you were previously at the Department of Transport. What did you do there?
I worked in transport for 10 years, buying trains and letting rail franchises, and I was the interim commercial director there before I then joined the Cabinet Office.
And you joined the Cabinet Office in May 2018. What was your role at that point?
So I had the title of Delivery Director, and my responsibility was to lead on functional strategy, efficiency, and government spend controls.
And in what capacity did you first get involved in NHS Test and Trace?
So I joined NHS Test and Trace in September 2020. And that was when Jackie Rock had just become the Chief Commercial Officer, and she was putting together a team of commercial directors to lead the new commercial function in Test and Trace.
And what was your job title at that point?
So at that time, I was the commercial director for sourcing and delivery. for context, this was obviously we were building a massive commercial function at a very short time scale. So there were 5 directors, commercial directors. I had initially the responsibility for common goods and services, so all the logistics and professional services and arrangements around establishing the test and trace program. And then from April 21, I then also took over the procurement of new testing technologies and lab capacity and consumables, reagents and equipment.
And then since January 2022, you've been the commercial director of UKHSA.
Yes, that's correct.
It might be helpful at the outset, because you're the first witness in this module of the inquiry to deal specifically with testing, just to explain what UKHSA is. It came into being in October 2021. And could you just briefly outline the purpose and some of the predecessor organisations that we might discuss as well?
Yes, certainly. UKHSA was established, as you say, October 21, and was basically a combination of what was Test and Trace, Public Health England, and the Joint Biosecurity Centre, and subsequently also the Vaccines Task Force that joined later on. UKHSA is basically here to fight or protect the public from infectious disease as well as CBRN threat, so it's health security. Building on the lessons from COVID in terms of making sure that we're able to protect the public from new threats that comes up. If you want a little bit of background about PHE and the other organisations, do you want me to give that? Or?
I think that's good for now,
Okay,
but we might ask further questions as they come up and as they're relevant. Specifically about Public Health England, in January 2020, when we first began to hear about coronavirus as the general public, what was Public Health England's role in relation to testing at that point?
Yeah, so Public Health England had, I guess, because this is a commercial module, I'll cover the commercial element to it as well. But the organisation had public health protection in the remit. It did not have the sort of remit to scale up the level of testing that we saw through the pandemic, the mass testing. What they did really well was developing the first PCR test, the first assay, and in the early days did the testing sort of almost sort of in-house within the labs. But then when there was a need to scale up the size that the political ministerial direction, then it was quite clear that a new organisation needed to be set up, or a new programme needed to be set up to deal with the scale of significance. The commercial function within PHE, I would sort of call it a classic procurement function with small group of individuals that did a really good job, but their role was to source sort of corporate services, as well as they had established a framework, a microbiology framework, but it was only there to support the organisation in buying sort of reagents and supplies, but at a very small scale.
Okay, so you've said that Public Health England didn't at that point have the remit to scale up. When you say remit, do you mean that that wasn't within their role as defined by statute, or that they didn't have the capacity to do that?
So I think if you read their remit letter, it was quite clear there was a certain amount of sort of roles that they had in terms of the scientific elements, but they did not have the capacity nor the remit to scale up what was required in terms of rolling out the scale of testing program that was then decided. That wasn't part of their remit.
So if a pandemic had hit, and indeed it did, where did that responsibility lie? What was the plan for mass testing, if there was one?
So I don't think there was a plan for mass testing at the scale. I think those are the lessons that we're learning now through this inquiry. And I think it's what's really important, and we'll come into lessons learned throughout this session here, is that also what's important to recognise that testing was a real focus. Diagnostics is a core part of pandemic preparedness, but it might also be other initiatives that are needed going forward. But at the time, it was scientific recommendation as well as a political direction to establish a mass-scale programme as was decided. That may not be the decision next time.
You've said in your witness statement that as of the 1st of March 2020, PHE could process about 2,000 PCR tests a day, and at that point we were just talking about PCR tests.
Yes.
And by the end of March, PHE and the NHS were able to process about 10,000. So that's quite a significant scale up already.
Yes.
But did you have to go beyond PHE at some point?
Yes. So, and just to say, obviously, I wasn't in the organisation at the time, but this is all set out in the statement. So, what happened was, remember the context. We didn't have a COVID test that was developed at a rapid pace in January, and PHE stood up. Testing staff left other work and supported this. NHS labs helped as well, but when the ministerial decision was to scale up to 100,000, they were not equipped to do that at all, and that is why the Lighthouse lab came on board in early April, where we started. And also tests could be commercialised.
And the national testing programme was established at that point in mid-March, is that correct?
Yes.
And that was a predecessor to what became known as NHS Test and Trace, which was later, as you've already explained,
correct.
Involved in UK HSA. So going back to when it was the national testing programme at the very beginning, whose responsibility was setting up the national testing programme and specifically thinking about the commercial function? Where did that lie?
So I think it's important to break this up in the time phases. So initially, I believe DHSC decided to establish the testing programme, and at that point. Very early on, there was a team in the Cabinet Office, complex transaction team, and I believe you're seeing both Daniel after me, and she and her just a group of commercial specialists from the complex and transaction team joined the efforts in March. Literally, sort of from one day to another, came in to support this. Of what was in the early days, I think. It wasn't particularly clear what the sort of the journey was going to happen. So they rolled their sleeves up and supported the efforts in contracting with labs to get the testing capacity up. If you want me to explain a little bit further, or
that's very helpful for now. Thank you.
Just for either of you, go on. Sorry. Where does this all fit in with the ending of community testing? Temporary ending of community testing on the 8th of March, wasn't it?
So that's the following year.
Oh, we're talking about. So you're talking about 2021.
So 2020, when.
Sorry, of course. So the 8th of March was 2020. The end of community testing was in 2020.
No,
so I thought you were talking. You talked about 1st of March 2020. PHE could do 2,000 a day. End of March up to 10, early April, I thought you were 2020, Lighthouse Labs, and the National Testing Programme established mid-March.
Yes.
But also, I thought, and I don't know whether any of the core participants who are with me in the other modules can help, I thought community testing was stopped on the 8th of March because we asked questions of Dame Jenny Harris whether it was because of a lack of tests or some other policy decision. But that was March 2020, I think, wasn't it? Am I going mad, Mr. Wetherby? You don't. Sorry, I won't embarrass you, Mr. Wetherby. I'm pretty confident it was.
So it might be a confusion about what we mean by community testing.
Basically, testing went to the healthcare sector.
Apologies. What I was referring to was the community testing programme that was established in the autumn to roll out. Testing through the local authorities. Apologies.
Okay, can we start again? End of March, PHE could do 100,000. Was it 100,000? No, 10,000 a day.
Correct.
Early April, Lighthouse Labs, mid-March national testing programme. What was the national testing programme?
So the National Testing Programme was the programme established by the Department for Health and Social Care to scale up testing.
Testing whom?
So there were different phases of who was in scope. So initially, obviously, it was the sort of the vulnerables, the people who were. It's actually set out in the statement, but let me sort of get to it. It was the.
It's paragraph 314.
Yes, forgive me here.
So it's the vulnerable and those needing management of pneumonia admitted to hospital.
So there was a whole, obviously, testing was rolled out to as soon as they became available to various groups, and that was decided by, well, there's a group of scientists advising government on which groups that they should be rolling out testing to, from people in the healthcare sector, and then obviously that increased in scope.
Sorry to interrupt, Ms. Gordon.
Could we please bring up on screen INQ 000514384 and at page 1. Just going back to what you were saying about where the commercial function lay at each point in the history of the National Testing Programme or NHS Test and Trace. You've explained that when the National Testing Programme was first set up, as my lady has pointed out, in the middle of May, and took over that responsibility for testing from PHE. That was an action which was initiated by DHSC. And at that point, the commercial function was provided by the Cabinet Office, and we're going to hear from another witness later on about that. As you've also explained, you came on board in September of 2020, and this email is from just before that, in August 2020. And if we go just to the bottom of page 1 and the penultimate paragraph, we can see this is a draft email which is going to be sent to the workforce of NHS Test and Trace, announcing the appointment of a new Chief Commercial Officer, Jackie Rock, and also a new Chief Financial Officer. And we read here, we recognise this has been an area of concern across the programme which needs improvement, and we've put in a series of measures to streamline approvals in the past few weeks. So are we to understand from this that at the point when you and also Jackie Rock, who's also provided a statement to the inquiry, came on board, there had been some concerns up until that point about where the commercial function lay in relation to testing?
Yeah, so for context, when Bev and the colleagues from Cabinet Office joined, it wasn't really a function. It was commercial people joining to support, still under the reins of Department for Health and Social Care, so they couldn't sign the contracts, for instance. They were sort of part of that, but it wasn't really a function. They were sort of just embedded within the team supporting. Would you describe that as akin to consultancy or secondees? Or no, I mean, I think they were very so much part of the teams, but for instance, there wasn't a commercial director sitting at sort of exco level part of those discussions. It was very much they were. I don't even think they sort of appeared on the org chart. They were part of the effort supporting. But what was quite clear became clear that this was establishing a sort of very large organisation as well as a very big commercial organisation. It required that commercial leadership, and that was why the decision was made to appoint Jackie Rock as the Chief Commercial Officer, to then establish a function with the right level of governance, the right also number of staff as well. So we ended up being around 378 at the peak of the organisation, and that just gives you a sort of indication of the scale and the complexity and what was required to support this programme.
And just to give us an idea, what difference did that make at that point to the teams actually doing the procurement on the ground?
In terms of scaling up? And
Well,
having
in terms of who could sign contracts, approvals, did the process become more streamlined, as this email indicates?
So absolutely. So what we did. So the complex transaction team had to get DHSC staff to sign contracts. When we established the test and trace commercial function, we established governance, an investment board, and we had delegation to sign contracts. So I would have it, and my direct reports as well, the category leads, but only the civil servants. And a lot of the staff that joined the commercial function, there was a combination of people that were qualified commercial staff from the government commercial organisation that were parachuted in, as well as contractors and staff from elsewhere, but under the leadership of Jackie. And we had the assurance processes, we implemented business case templates, and the whole rigour that was required to be able to take all these procurements and cases through to procure. So it made a huge difference. Personally, I will also say I joined at that time and realised, my goodness, this was what the team, the 30 people had been doing is heroic in terms of actually just try and support. But it was quite clear that there was needed to be a rebalance in terms of having more staff on the ground and support the organisation that didn't have the commercial capability and understanding of procurement regulations. That was really important.
Thank you. And we're going to explore that period before the appointment of Ms. Rock with our later witness. But to give us an idea of how the procurement for the testing operation actually worked, could you explain how suppliers came into the testing programme?
Yes, in the early days.
At the point where you began to work in the testing program.
Okay. So, but perhaps I probably should just explain a little bit what happened before I joined, because
Yes.
in the early days of test and trace, there was a call to arms, and because the procurement function in PHE didn't have relationship with industry, and I think there's a theme emerging around the importance of having those engagements and established relationship with industry. Various efforts were put into place to engage with industry. So and that's why there were webinars and calls and sort of active contacting potential suppliers that could support that. There was also no sort of right routes to market as well, so there weren't those established relationships in place. So when I joined, we had various call to arms and engagement, but we focused really on establishing frameworks that could help us to have more a sort of standard approach to procuring tests and equipment from, so particularly the DPS and the microbiology framework, which had started a little bit earlier, the developments of that, but those were establishments that was important for us to have faster ways of procuring.
Thank you. And we're going to come and look at the framework and the DPS in more detail later on. You mentioned the call to arms.
Yes.
And also industry webinars. And in your statement, you also set out that contacts that came through, whether it was those mechanisms or elsewhere, could come into a variety of mailboxes. And UK EHSA has done a piece of work around analysing how the organisations that were contracted with came in and were contracted with. So could you just briefly explain what the mailboxes were, how they were categorised, and how offers were triaged as they came in?
Yes, so the triage, so I asked for this study to happen, but it was a review of some mailboxes that were established before even some of them before test and trace time, to understand basically had there been any sort of special preference to suppliers. So trying to understand, what were the reason for these inboxes, email boxes. what's really, again, important to sort of recognise is that when industry wants to engage with government, it's really important that there's clarity of how do they go about this. So I can understand why there were 4 email boxes that were established as a means of suppliers or referrers to put them forward to those inboxes based on the calls to arms, and people would have come up. And I think it's important to recognise that this wasn't Joe Blocks from the street corner. This is a quite complicated sector, diagnostics sector. So there were companies getting in touch with government to support their efforts. In the review, which we did subsequently to understand, well, how did they work, and what did they lead to? And basically, the review concluded that these inboxes were sort of means of people to get in touch with. It was a means of triaging requests, but it didn't give a preferential treatment, or it didn't circumvent the procurement process, which is a really important finding. So it was a way of coordinating responses. The other important thing that's important to recognise around the testing side is that every test has to go through validation. So with the triaging process, what would happen was that somebody would get in touch with, might be a product here, whether it's PCR or whether it's lateral flows. They would get in touch, but then there would be a sort of a desktop sort of analysis, and then they would be put forward to the scientific teams in PHE, and they were separate, and they would be evaluating the tests to see whether they were meeting the sort of quality standards. And they did that blind, so they didn't know who had referred them or not. They were just doing that, and then if they passed the validation, then it could be sort of processed, and a procurement could, or direct award. Majority of them in the early days were direct awards, would be established. So they were separate to that.
Thank you. You've absolutely anticipated where I'm going to go. So can we get on the screen INQ 000383567 and page 5? This is the piece of work that you were just mentioning, the commercial supplier triage analysis, which I believe is from January 2022. And this is just the executive summary, and there is a useful summary here of the number of suppliers in paragraph 9. There were 50 suppliers who were identified as priority. Now, how was a supplier identified as priority? What did that mean?
So again, this is based on our review. So it was basically whether they had a reference from an MP or senior person in government, or there was somebody that we sort of were known person. It was basically. It was not about whether they should be prioritised. It was just more about who had referred them.
So we've heard already in this module, and I'm sure you've heard in the media largely before then, about a VIP lane for PPE, or as it's also known, the high priority lane. And this is basically the equivalent of that. I'm not saying in every way, but in that you end up in the categorised as priority because you are a contact of, as you've said, a minister or another high-ranking person. Is that correct?
So I don't think that's the case at all, no. So it's unfortunate that they were called priority, and I've sort of, one of our recommendations in this review was for not to call them priority. What they were was a means of people contacting government saying, we have some tests, we have some products that we would like to offer. What would then happen was that they would be reviewed, say, well, does this look like a sensible thing or not? And then it would go through a separate process, the validation process.
Yes, you've explained that, and not to cut across you, but forgetting the fact that they were labelled priority and not saying at this point that they were prioritised for this reason, but they were put into that category initially for the purpose of triage because they were a contact of a senior government official. Is that correct?
Well, I think we didn't find any evidence of them giving any special preferential treatment.
Yes, you've said that, and we'll look at that later.
I'm afraid we're dancing on the head of a pin here because everything you've said so far does suggest to me that this is really quite similar to what we had in the other procurement exercise we've analysed. You say here, we have identified 50 suppliers with contracts who could be considered a priority or equivalent because of their entry route. So in other words, it's, I think Ms Mitchell came up with the expression in asking Lord Feldman, it's triaging the person as opposed to the actual contract. So you didn't identify 50 suppliers with contracts because of their track record or how long they'd been in business or whether they'd supplied this kind of kit before, but because of how they got there, in other words, referred by an MP. Isn't that... I totally understand the argument that once you're there, you're not going to get through unless you can come up with the goods. So I do understand all of that and that everything has to be evaluated. It's just this point, is it fair to say this is substantially different from the other system?
So I don't know the detail of the other system. What I know is that there were different inboxes. What we found was that we didn't feel that this particular inbox was prioritised more than another one where suppliers could come forward. But I'm also, we did a review. I wasn't there at the time, so I can only base it on the evidence that's in front of us.
Perhaps it would assist if we go to another part of this document.
Yeah.
If we go to page 11 and paragraph 25, this is explaining how offers were categorised as priority for the purpose of this document. It's those where VIP, fast track, high priority or referral was mentioned in the correspondence. Those where suppliers were involved in email correspondence with a VIP individual, perhaps with a Parliament or number 10 email address, or is involved in correspondence via the priority contacts mailbox. And you've explained in your witness statement that for the first two categories listed in those bullet points, that would happen if an offer came in via a senior government official or senior civil servant. So we're just at this point, my lady's point is you're talking about the point of entry to the system.
Yeah.
And as you say, whether it's prioritised, you deal with in this report. So we'll look at that now. If we go back, please, to page 5, where we were, and paragraph 9, it's noted that of those 50 suppliers who were identified as priority, that amounted to 76% of the total contracted spend for this period. Now, you noted elsewhere in this report that that figure might be skewed because of one contract in particular, and that is detailed at page 7. So if we can go to page 7, please. So this is the list of suppliers which have been identified as priority. And we can see the original referrer in the far right-hand column. And we can also see the total value of the contracts. I won't take us through all 50 of them because it goes over 3 pages. But you do mention elsewhere in this document that the figure, in terms of it being 76% of total spend, is somewhat skewed by this first contract, Innova Medical.
Yes.
As we can see, there were 9 contracts agreed with Innova. In total, they value more than 3 billion. and the original referrer was Dominic Cummings from number 10. And that was identified through a deep dive that UKHSA carried out. Can you explain why there was such a disproportionately large spend on this one supplier?
Yes, I can. And just to say, we found, in this particular one, we found one reference to Dominic Cummings. It's very likely that Innover would have contacted government through other means to offer off their product. So the reason why the number with Innover is so high is that there were 3 companies in September that passed through validation for lateral flow tests. And that was a really important moment for government, because that meant that we could roll out, at the time it wasn't self-test, but we could do testing on lateral flows. So as a result, we went into contract with Innover and Tanner & Abbott, the 2 other companies. And Innover happened to have a large manufacturing capacity, so we were able to contract larger amounts with them. And this was in the day where we didn't have a dynamic purchasing system, so we didn't have a route to market, because this is a new product. So hence we had to do a Regulation 32 direct award. What happened was that over the course of the month, that to roll out mass testing, it was required it was made sense to get self-use, and Test and Trace worked with Innover because they had the capacity, but also were very flexible in it sounds quite technical, but the pack sizes, which actually really was important from a cost perspective, because if you could have boxes of 3 and 7s, there were smaller packages that could then be rolled out for testing. And they were incredibly flexible in developing that, and that's why the department became the legal manufacturer for that. So that's the result. A bigger proportion of LFDs were procured from them. But then when we established the framework in March, or the dynamic purchasing system, we then had a market, and we could start to, we could obviously drive competition, and we were able there were far more manufacturers on board at the time, and we could contract with others as well.
Thank you. And we're going to discuss that period of time with the advent of lateral flow devices, and also the setting up of the DPS in more detail later on. So you've explained that the total spend is somewhat skewed because of that contract. Another way of measuring whether or not priority contracts were prioritised in actual fact might be by examining the number of contracts which were awarded to them as compared to those that entered through other lanes. So I want to take us to page 13 of this document. And this is also set out in your witness statement. And at the very top in the table, just beneath paragraph 28, we have successful suppliers as percentage of total offers, and 3 mailboxes: COVID testing triage, COVID testing priority contacts, COVID-19 innovation. And as you can see, the percentage is substantially higher for those that have been marked priority. As you've already said, this document is at pains to explain that all contracts in relation to testing went through a very detailed technical assessment, and that was carried out by a separate team who had no knowledge of how the particular supplier had entered the process. However, it doesn't explain why such a significant percentage of priority contacts were awarded contracts as compared to those that entered through other routes. Was that because those offers were, as we've heard in relation to other items procured during the pandemic, they were handheld through the process, or they were hurried through the process quicker by virtue of having a champion in the form of their priority contract?
So again, I need to caveat with the fact that this is a study that we did, but we didn't find that particular suppliers were being handheld. So to give an example of the Innova one, where there was one reference to Dominic Cunnings, there was nothing follow-up through from him subsequently. Another supplier that's on there is SureScreen, which became our UK make company. We actually, if you read Chris Hall's evidence statement, is that he actually had to convince them to join the efforts and supply. So I think I would be cautious about sort of just broad brushing, saying this is sort of evidence of them being handheld. I can't say what happened outside of the inboxes, because we only looked at the inboxes, but I haven't seen any evidence of ministers pushing for specific suppliers. In fact, I saw sometimes the opposite, if I may, my lady. There were a couple of instances where, with Lord Bethel, where there were suppliers that were being quite proactive and wanting to get a foot in, and we sort of said to him, can you deal with them so we can focus on our commercial work? So actually shielding the team, because it was very important that the team could get on with procuring the tests that had been validated and they were ready. And to be honest, in the early days, it was almost like we needed to contract with anyone that had the capacity. So it was that's why we were so focused on the validation exercise, because it really was important that we had the quality tests. So. But that's probably as far as I can sort of give you on this.
You say that you didn't look outside of these inboxes as what was happening to these contracts outside of that. Why not?
Well, what we didn't do is we looked at 4 inboxes. What we didn't have access to was obviously people's individual email addresses, or that would be sort of a cross-government effort. And if you compare it to sort of normal standards, there will be, we see this often, where suppliers will be contacting MPs or ministers and saying, oh, please, can we, can you do something for us? And the answer is, well, no, because we run procurements. But there are regular sort of contacts between suppliers and government. So I guess the challenge was it was sort of looking for a needle in a haystack. It would have been quite difficult. Even looking at those 4 inboxes was incredibly challenging for us to get access to them in the first place.
Given the much higher percentage of contacts awarded contracts in the testing priority inbox, did that not prompt you to say, perhaps we need to do a wider piece of work to see what was happening to these contracts and why they were more likely to be awarded contracts?
So we had a choice. I mean, we'd spent an awful lot of time on this. I think from a lessons learned perspective, if we can refer to that pack, it was actually more important for us to be clear on how do we do a proper front door going forward. So that's what my focus was on, establishing a new commercial function in UKHSA. Where we have now got a front door which is managed in a very transparent manner, because industry does need an access point, but it's important that it's not influenced by people or that no one is being handheld, but that we're following the proper processes. And that's why once we'd done this report, we were like, okay, well, let's learn from this, and then let's make sure that there's no, I wouldn't call anything like these what some of these inboxes call priority. That is not language that I would use, because I think that's unhelpful.
I want to turn to more generally address the involvement of ministers in testing procurement. One thing you said in your witness statement is that COVID-19 policy decisions shaped the procurement of testing technologies during the pandemic. I was wondering if you could explain a little more what you meant by that.
So forgive me if you could repeat.
By policy decisions shaping the procurement.
Yes. So it's important to establish, my lady, that obviously commercial is an enabling function. So we follow the direction of ministers, but also policy colleagues. It's really important, and I think that's what's the strength of Test and Trace, but also UKHSA now, that we have far closer collaboration between the scientists and the commercial people to establish what are the requirements and are the deliverable because I think in the early days of test and trace and the testing programme, decisions were announced before actually an assessment of whether this was possible or not. I think the teams did a heroic effort in scaling up testing, but there was a challenge here where, when you look through the statement, there were often, weekly policy announcements made, and the procurement teams had to be incredibly agile to support the delivery of those, and that was incredibly challenging. I think they did an incredible job in achieving it, but when announcements are being made without assessing the market, clearly it was also about giving the public the confidence that government was on it and tests would be rolled out. But it does create a challenge for people who need to deliver it.
Could I ask you to slow down?
Okay, apologies, I will.
So let's look at some examples of that you give in your statement. There was a move around about the time when you came on board to the testing programme in the autumn of 2020, away from PCR, or perhaps not away from PCR, but towards rapid tests, lateral flow devices. And at that time, the Prime Minister announced on the 9th of September what was then called Operation Moonshot. And your statement sets out, and if you want to see it, it's at paragraph 4132 at page 47, that this was actually against the advice of NHS Test and Trace. Can you just explain what NHS Test and Trace advised at that point from a procurement perspective, and then how that impacted, if at all, on the Prime Minister's announcement?
So I don't believe commercial was involved in the sort of decision of whether we should be doing Moonshot or not. That was quite a small group of people, and Dido Harding was obviously the chair of NHS Test and Trace. But the advice at the time was obviously that if we were going to roll out lateral flow testing, we needed to establish a market, because we didn't have a market and we didn't have a product either, and that came through from September onwards. I believe from reading sort of various statements is that there was a reluctance to do Operation Moonshot in the sense of doing it in a very short timescale of testing people twice. Was actually the recommendation was to do more targeted testing programs in the various sort of groups, and hence my confusion. Apologies about the community testing. But from a commercial perspective, this was all about all the announcements, making sure that the capacity was there, and that's why a lot of effort would put into designing the dynamic purchasing system. But it couldn't be done until we had the products, and that's why. There was a real tension there, but the enabling team, the commercial team, was there to support and did what they could.
So when the Prime Minister announced Operation Moonshot on the 9th of September, did you have the products?
So 2 days later, the Innova test was validated. I believe that was on the 11th of September, followed by the two other products. So technically, it hadn't been validated yet.
But in the quantities that you needed?
Forgive me.
So as of the 11th,
yeah.
You had an approved test. But did you have an expectation that you would be able to get it in the quantities that you needed to carry out Operation Moonshot?
So the challenge was, at the time, it was only sort of relatively small amounts. So it wasn't possible to scale up at that demand target yet. But again, I'm not even sure numbers were talked about I haven't seen that from the work I've done in putting the statement together. But it's fair to say that the ambition to push for lateral flows was incredibly challenging because of the need to obviously make sure that the manufacturers actually could deliver what they did.
You set out that continued to grow, and one factor in that was the approval by the World Health Organization of lateral flow devices.
Yes.
As a test for COVID. And following that, a request came directly from Number 10 to secure lateral flow devices. Yes. And how many did you need to secure at that point?
So I believe there was various requests, and the orders are set out in the statement. So I wasn't involved in the actual procurement, but there was basically it was what capacity do they have, and then let's buy it, and that was the sense. And again, in terms of context, by the WHO declaring it, it was also a matter of let's get this before any other countries are. There's a famous quotation of Dominic Cummings saying, "Well, let's just buy, and get the stock in."
And you set out in your statement as well that demand for lateral flow devices continually ramped up over the next couple of months. They were a key part of the winter plan, the community testing programme, the route out of lockdown that was announced in spring 2021. And we have also asked you in your statement, and you've set out an answer that I'd like you to expand on, about the impact that increasing pressure to procure had on your procurement process. Had you not had that constant dialing up of targets, how would your procurement process have been different?
I think that needs breaking down a little bit, because it's also depending on what product we're talking about here. So we, at the time, there were sort of two routes to market. We call them routes to market, and basically axes of procuring. And there was a microbiology framework where we could procure PCR capacity. That original framework didn't have basically the right lots, so we didn't have access to buy huge capacity of PCR capacity, lab capacity, nor did it have the right value. So if you breach the value of the framework, you sort of make it redundant, and you can end up sort of being challenged by all the suppliers on that framework. So we didn't have that, and that's why the effort was put in place to let that framework. On the DPS side, the dynamic purchasing system, that couldn't be put in place until we had products. So work started in that autumn, and the dynamic purchasing system was established in March, so that procurement could happen. So let alone the sort of the capacity, it was important to have the right route to market, and that's why in the early days the only solution was Regulation 32. And then the other challenge was capacity. So there was a global market, and needing to procure this at pace and getting access to this product rather than them going to other places also put a lot of pressure on the function. But it meant that they had to sort of constantly let contracts, and because the goalposts basically kept changing.
And you've already mentioned that this was a brand new product. Most of them hadn't been approved at this point, and the offers that you were receiving were for tests that had not yet been evaluated and passed testing. You also say that the majority of the offers that you received for lateral flow devices they were all tested, but the majority of them failed testing. How did that affect your procurement?
Well, this meant that there was smaller supply. So the team at Porton Down, who established the evaluation function, I think they've now reviewed up to 200 lateral flows, but they went through a lot of LFDs who were just not of a quality or sort of sensitivity of picking up COVID, and that's why it was quite a challenge of then, as soon as their test was approved, we could then procure from them.
Mm-hmm. And I want to move ahead in the timeline just a bit. We will come back and talk a bit more about the DPS and the microbiology framework. But as another example of how ministers interact with procurement of testing in this period, I believe that there was a series of conversations with the Treasury in autumn 2021 about longer-term procurement. What's the nature of those discussions?
So in 2021, so there was this sort of tension of demand keep changing, and there was new variants, and the landscape was incredibly challenging to plan. So there was demand forecasting, but often when a new announcement was made or there was a new variant, it had to change. But what we were very keen on in Test and Trace was to get, if you buy larger orders, you get better discounts, and to actually start having planning also for the winter. To make sure the pressure was eased off of the NHS. So there was a desire to buy sort of a larger order of lateral flows. And there were negotiations with the Treasury, and basically an agreement was made to sort of buy half of what was required. And then what happened was that Omicron happened. And suddenly there was this sort of need for buying at really fast pace. So we ended up having to sort of do that at a very short time scales in December, and reverting back to direct award because we had sort of outdone the what was available to buy through the DPS at that time.
So just to summarise that, it was NHS Test and Trace at this point. In the early autumn, and then it became UKHSA in October. So we're at that transition period. But the testing programme, shall I say, was advocating for a contingency supply of lateral flow devices to get you through the winter. Treasury would only approve half that supply. In the end, because of Omicron, you ended up having to make a series of direct awards. So not going through a more rigorous procurement process because of that last-minute urgent decision necessitated by Omicron.
Yeah, so I would be cautious about using the word rigorous because we still use the terms and conditions of the DPS. It was more the fact that with the dynamic purchasing system, you run mini competitions and they can take, 2 or 3 weeks. And at that time, we didn't have that. And we also needed the capacity again from suppliers. And they hadn't been warned. So suddenly it was back out to say, well, who can provide, these huge numbers of additional capacity at short timescale, get them flown into the UK. And that's also why the number of Innova sort of rose up because again they just had more capacity. So yes.
And at that time there was another factor, wasn't there, that impinged on that was important for supply. The Prime Minister announced on the 8th of December Plan B, and that included a requirement for a COVID-19 pass validated by lateral flow test. And also the potential for an earlier release from self-isolation if you'd previously tested positive by testing with a lateral flow device. When that was announced on the 8th of December, that obviously had an impact on the amount of lateral flow devices you needed to buy. Did you have any forewarning of that announcement?
So I didn't personally know, and I believe not many had. In Test and Trace.
Do you believe anyone from the commercial side of testing knew that this was going to happen?
Not in the commercial, no, because I would have known as the director there, but I can't tell from other people in the organisation or discussions with the Cabinet Office.
Thank you. Just going to move to spending controls more generally, and we'll touch on the DPS and the framework that you've already explained. But first of all, benchmarking. What were the problems with benchmarking in this context, both with PCRs and then later with lateral flow devices?
So again, this comes back to the timing element of it. So in the early that benchmarking was incredibly, so when I mean early days, I mean the establishment of the testing programme in that spring of 2020. So it was incredibly difficult to benchmark because the prices that the team had to compare with was on a standard framework rate in a world where there was plenty of supply. When demand increased, that was difficult to then to work out what sort of pricing that they should be sort of looking at, and that's where Bev will have some greater detail in terms of what they did. But they got offers in and sort of compared the prices to each other, the different contracts. What happened was, obviously, when we then put our frameworks in place, that became easier. And with what you see with when you run competitions, you can, you get a price, and we saw a huge improvement. I mean, our DPS on the lateral flows, we saved 70%, but just on the pricing from the original costings that had been in the early days. So, but I think benchmarking, you have to be really cautious in the sense that, what are you comparing? So in a world where there is very little supply, then that does impact pricing. But the teams did, all they could in terms of trying to compare cost and look at whether the offers were reasonable. And then ultimately there was a decision of whether, through governance, whether the investment should be made. And I guess that's a really important point to make, that procurement decisions were made through governance and scrutiny through our investment board cycle.
You've explained that in the spring of 2021, that was when the new microbiology framework came into force, and you also had a dynamic purchasing system for lateral flow devices that went live around that time. Why were the previous frameworks that PHE had in place not suitable for that kind of procurement?
So the original microbiology framework didn't have the procurement of lab capacity. So we added 2 new lots to it in the revised version, so that we could go out and buy from Surge Labs additional labs. So that was a really important factor. And the other thing was the fact that, and I believe I mentioned early on around the cap of the spend. So if it's if one procurement breaks the limitation of the spend, you make the framework redundant, and you actually there's a higher risk, because other suppliers will say, well, hang on, you've basically dismantled the framework by one procurement, and that's why Regulation 32, which is used obviously for emergencies, but also sometimes when there's only one product as well, which we often see in health, particularly in the vaccines arena, where there might only be one validated product or single source, so you can use it in that way.
That perhaps takes us to lessons learned quite swiftly, actually. One of the things that we've already discussed is that PHE did not have capacity to scale testing. And it was the organisation that had the responsibility for protecting the public from infectious disease. As you've explained, that responsibility is transferred now to UKHSA. So to what extent has the testing programme as we knew it in 2020-2021 been dismantled, and what are the plans to scale it up should a pandemic of similar proportions occur again?
Yeah, so there's quite a lot in that question. So firstly, we don't know what the next pathogen will be, or the type of pandemic, and a ministerial decision was made to scale back. So we got rid of almost 2,000 contracts. We basically scaled back to a standard capability. And what we have now within UKHSA is, that does lead me to some of the lessons, is that what's really important, because we don't know what the types of disease that it would be, investing in, some big lab that has a specific testing capability may not be the right focus. So what's important for us is to have access, which we didn't have at the time, the right routes to market. So access to Surge Labs that we can procure from at a rapid scale. Within UKHSA as well, what we're looking at the moment is there's a certain level of capacity that we can do in-house. There's some further investments that we're looking to make around if that can be increased. But to give you an example, in terms of capacity, depends on what category of lab you need, if it's CL3 or CL2, so the types of lab environment you need. So we're looking at how that can be strengthened internally to scale up at a slightly higher amount. But then any further decisions on, let's say, if we're going to do 100,000 tests a day, that is part of the spending review planning, because again, that's a decision for the government to say, well, what do they want to fund? But I do believe that it's important to have, and we've reflected a lot on this, about making sure that we have the partnerships, the understanding of the capabilities out in the marketplace, as well as the routes to market. And perhaps, if I may, to give you an example on the lateral flow side. So we've based on the lessons from the evaluation work and validation work we did, we've got something called a diagnostics accelerator, and it's a team in Porton Down that basically works with industry to evaluate tests that are coming. So new innovations, new products, and where we feel there's a gap. So if there's a threat that we think we need to get access to a test, we collaborate and develop it together. Or we also provide the service to evaluate manufacturers' tests so that they can commercialize and scale up. We don't have, as an organisation, funding to go out and build supply chains in that regard. But what's really important is the understanding of the products and the innovations that's out there. And the other thing we've done is we are looking at we are doing the final touches on the next version of a microbiology framework, where innovation and products, innovative products, is going to be a real focus on being able to contract with manufacturers who have new inventions and new products that we can then get access to. So it's really important that there's a kind of a combination of areas, but particularly the partnerships and understanding the market capability is something that we're really focusing on, because that's going to help us to then scale up, which will then require additional funding if we need to reach the testing amounts that we've seen previously.
So you talked a bit about your partnerships with industry in relation to innovation, and as my lady's inquiry has heard and indeed recommended in previous modules, the importance of being pathogen agnostic, yes, in terms of preparedness. So we're perhaps better prepared than we used to be, from what you've told us about for a pathogen agnostic pandemic, in terms of innovating new tests, new treatments. But what about in terms of scaling that up? Do the new frameworks and the new routes to market you've described give that flexibility, not just for innovating a single product or test or treatment, but also for providing that on a mass scale like we had to in the COVID pandemic?
So let me break this down. So just to say, it's not just about being, well, it is about being pathogen agnostic, but we've just recently procured, so one of the news threads is H5N1 to avian influenza, and we've procured some tests based on the evidence we've seen. But clearly it is small scale, my lady, and I think the challenge here becomes then a funding decision, because we've got the routes to suppliers who can scale up, but it costs money to keep them warm, and it's incredibly expensive. And what we need to make sure is that we're obviously keeping the right types of technologies warm. So that's a huge question here, when you're having to sort of trade off with other challenges. So from my perspective, this is where the Office of Life Sciences comes in, and the industrial strategy in terms of actually what is it that we want to do to strengthen the diagnostic industry, because we can't just keep it warm by UKHSA is spending a very limited amount. This is a much wider decision around what we want to do to strengthen the industry, but it's a really important one, because if we were going to scale up, there's a whole set of kind of areas that we need to consider in terms of making sure that if we have the facilities here, the products and access to those raw materials, but it's a much bigger decision than just for us.
Is the answer to Ms. Gardner's question, no, we don't currently have the flexibility to scale up. We'd have to do it as another pandemic hit, but that's a political decision and not one that UKHSA can control.
Yes, I mean we've got some in the lower between 3 and 10 or 12,000 that could be scaled up to probably around 25. But beyond that, absolutely, then that's a ministerial funding decision.
And what about UKHSA's commercial capacity? Does that have the ability to scale, or will you again rely on the government commercial function, on external consultants? What is the plan there?
So we're not starting from scratch again. So one of the really important things of UKHSA is the strengthening of particularly commercial capability, but also clearly our data analytics and other sort of key specialist areas. So what we did subsequently was to establish a function that last year we published our 5-year commercial strategy, setting out all of what our priorities are in terms of building capability, not just within the function, but also across the agency, because many of the, we work so much with industry that it's important that we have that commercial awareness. So we've got a healthy function, and we've upskilled staff are accredited, and we've got the ability to respond and as an agency respond to multiple incidents at the on a sort of regular basis. What we would need to is we've got the sort of core capability and much more than previous organisations had. There would become potentially a time where if we were going to sort of scale up even further, we would need to top up, but not in the same scale as what we saw in the early days of test and trace, where we basically had to build a function and establish new systems and as well.
My lady, those are all my questions. I believe there's some real tens.
I think, Ms Mitchell, you have a question. That way.
I appear as instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID bereaved. You and Dame Jenny Harris introduce a 2024 to 2029 document called A Commercial Strategy for UK Health Security. And in that document, you indicate that you will explore what you describe as the transformative potential of artificial intelligence. Can you explain what you see that transformative potential being? And are there any current barriers to progressing with that, such as cost, data protection, or simply not having enough data? What I'm looking for here is to find out what do we need to change to ensure that that full potential is reached.
I'll try and be brief. This is a big question because artificial intelligence can be implemented in many ways. Very locally within the function, what we're looking at is automation, better contract management, some of those things that eases the pressure of staff to then focus on some of the more strategic market engagement. But it's also about how we handle data as well. So we have a number of pilots going on in UKHSA looking at how we can AI can help us to operate more efficiently. So it's something that we're looking at. We're not there yet. This is a 5-year strategy, but it's something that we're really keen to work on, but also with the wider commercial function. So this is something that, being part of the government commercial organisation and commercial function, we're looking at to see how we can apply that in making things easier and simpler.
Milady, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Mitchell. Those are all the questions that we have for you, Ms Collins. I'm not sure, will I be calling on you again? I don't know. Has another module called on you? Has test and trace?
I don't believe so.
You may have
but
escaped.
UKHSA will be coming to, I think, every single session, every single module.
Right. Well, I'm not sure if you personally have escaped my further attention, but thank you very much for the help you've given so far.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very well. I shall break now and return at 2 o'clock.
All rise.